So without further ado, let's get right into the events. We're starting tonight with Johan from Mono, and he is going to talk about understanding user interface design in 2020. Where's my... Johan. There he is.
Hey.
Hey, welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight, and thanks for being our host.
Yes, thank you. I have to look into my camera. I'm using two screens. Thanks for the introduction. I guess I'll share my screen and do the talk.
Yep.
So can you see my screen? I'm just going to take it full screen and get started. Okay, so it's a bit weird doing this virtually. Like Annie said, if you have any questions during the talk, please send them to the chat and we'll try to answer them when the talk is finished. But I would like to welcome everyone to my talk on understanding user interface design 2020 edition. I want to give a bit of context about this talk. About 5 years ago, I lived in the beautiful city of Tokyo in Japan. And I quite liked living there. There were a lot of interesting things to see. In the photo on the right, you can see this beautiful building. It's the Asakusa Culture and Tourism Center. But beautiful buildings, that wasn't the only thing you could see in Tokyo. I quite like just checking out all the different interfaces that you can find. There's a lot of screens in Tokyo, and I quite enjoyed just checking out different interfaces, taking photos, inspecting them, and in general, just checking them out and looking what was cool about them. So I want to highlight two of those interfaces just as an intro. And one of the interfaces is this giant touchscreen. So most drink vending machines in Japan, they are analog. They work like the vending machines in Belgium. But this one is a super giant touchscreen. And you would get a recommendation, which was a bit weird, maybe a bit creepy. You would get a recommendation when you were standing in front of it of which drink you might want to like. Another another interface from Japan that I was particularly interested in is the screens on the metro. So this is from Japan Railways, and when you're in a train wagon, you can see how many minutes until the next stop. So that's on the left slide. And on the right photo, that's quite nice. You can see the relationship between the escalators and the exits and the car that you're sitting in. So all of these little details really add up to the user experience. And did you know that in Japan, there is also UX beers, except they call it a UX talk. So I was invited to speak at UX Talk, and I gave this presentation called Understanding User Interface Design, which is the exact same presentation title as today. It got quite a few, it was okay. I guess it went well because I got invited to also publish an article with the same content in Net Magazine. This was at the time that we founded Mono. So Mono had been founded for a couple of months at the time that I gave the talk. And this talk is a bit of an update to the same content. So I hope I've grown a little bit as a designer. I hope I have something new to say. But generally, it's the same talk that I gave then. And looking at the slides and the content and updating it to 2020, I noticed that a lot of things really stay the same for me. I'm still doing UI design. I'm still aiming for the same goals. I still want to do quality work. We've grown a little bit with our team. So we're 5 people now. And I think we're a stronger design team than we used to be. But without further ado, let's jump into the real talk, understanding user interface design. And on the right side of this slide, you can see the 4 parts of the talk. Context of this talk, which I just gave, then a small intro to Mono, and then the real meat of the talk, which is the work of a UI designer and how to improve in your craft. So intro to Mono, just for those who don't know Mono. My name is Johan. I'm a designer. I am also sometimes known as Wolfer on the internet. I do own a skateboard, but I don't skate. Just made it for fun when we got some mono stickers. And this is a bit of a sample of the kind of work we do. So on this slide, you can see a project that's a web application, but also a native iOS application that's used by real estate agents. And on this slide, you can see on the left side a kind of movie editing interface, which was a lot of fun to make. I quite enjoyed working on the timeline. And then on the right side here, you can see a school interface. So it's for planning lessons in a school and planning the lesson contents and which topics you're gonna give to students. This is from a few years ago, but I still quite like this work. I was quite fond of the result. And lastly, because this is not a portfolio talk, I don't want to talk about our work all the time. I want to show this mobile interface, which is used by maintenance people. So people who have to go on the road and maybe fix your boiler or fix some electricity thing. They have to know where they have to work, where they have to do their maintenance. So they use this app. And in general, that's the kind of applications that we design at Mono, the kind of long-lasting, durable applications that people use to get their jobs done. So, next section, the work of a UI designer. I think the work of a UI designer is divided into 3 parts: research and understanding the problem, communication, and design and prototyping work. Let's start with research, the first aspect. I think you want to work on understanding all kinds of facets of your project. You want to understand your client's business problem, you want to understand their users, but you also want to understand how they function as a company. And lastly, you want to understand the domain. You want to become knowledgeable in the domain and to be able to think along with the business. Your goal is to become a mini expert in the domain of your client. And I'm currently working on a government app for the Flemish government. So in my case, I need to know exactly how the Flemish government works, or else I can't do my work. I used to work on an aviation app. Maybe the persons who work on the real estate app, they have to understand that domain. So you have to understand the life, in my case, the life of a government worker. So in order to understand the domain, you will naturally partake in research activities. The most natural research activity is just the stakeholder meetings. Every project has a stakeholder meeting, so this just happens automatically. But then there's also user interviews, there's desk research, and those things are typically things you will have to initiate yourself. You will not get a user interview without asking for it. Trust me. So this quote stuck with me. I read it a while ago. I don't know who said it, but I think it's quite smart. UX without the user is just theater. You can spend a long time designing something that's not even going into the right direction if you neglect talking to the user. So I made a list of excuses to not talk to the user, and most of these excuses are coming from real-world projects. So these excuses have been given to me when I try to talk to the users. We already know what the user wants. We will do it ourselves. We don't need you to do it. We don't have budget, but then they do have budget for 20 developers. The project is still secret. We can't let it leak, or we will do it later. And then, of course, it gets postponed or it never happens. And I find that the companies who can actually do the user research, they have an edge. They know what their customers want. They actually research how people use interfaces, and those are typically the companies that will succeed. But the companies that work on their own and then launch something and hope that magically people will like it, those companies, I guess they will have a bit less success or even fail a little bit. So let's move on to the next section, or the next, let's say, part of your job as a UI designer, which is communication. Arguably the most important part of the job. If you can't communicate your design, if you can't communicate your intentions, then you have a bit of a problem. So we are a remote company. we use a bunch of different tools. We've been a remote company from before COVID-19, so we have been remote all the time, or I would say semi-remote, because we would sometimes just weekly meet up together. So this slide is about the tools. We use Slack just for the chats, for the quick communication. We use Notion as a knowledge base, and we use Zoom for video calls. And I had a lot of video calls lately. I'm sure everyone can relate. But communication is, of course, not only about tools. Tools are hugely important. The right tool is important. Paying for a quality tool is super important. But I believe work culture, company culture is of utmost importance, especially in these remote times. I want to just make a few points about communication. One of them is on focus time. So I think you need to respect the focus time. You need focus time to get things done and get in the zone. I think like people who don't have uninterrupted half-day blocks, then there's something wrong, especially if they're IC. So by IC, I mean individual contributor. So that's like a full-time designer. You need time to work in peace. You don't want your manager to be on top of you like every 3 hours and be like, hey, is the work already done? Can you give me an update? You need to trust your team, and you need to let people work in peace so they can get things done. And I also think people should do much more asynchronous communication. People tend to just open up a chat and start talking, but what's wrong with an email? What's wrong with a report? What's wrong with a good set of meeting notes? I think in a well-oiled team, those types of deliverables help communication tremendously. I want to highlight another point about communication, which is the presence trap. I think Jason Fried from Basecamp came up with this. So the presence trap. So presence trap, it means that just because they are online, there's like a green bubble on Slack, you can now bother them. I think that's wrong. I think you should really think about when you communicate, how you communicate. Maybe you should have a clear meeting schedule. Maybe you should feel out like, do we have too few meetings or do we have too many meetings? But just starting to chat to someone and calling up an impromptu meeting, that's a difficult word. That's the wrong way to go. So lastly, getting on the same page with stakeholders. So that's about design feedback, and about, actually the next point is about design feedback. So we have one more point to go about communication after this. So the third point, getting on the same page with stakeholders. I think traditionally you would send over the design and ask for feedback, but sending over the design and asking for feedback is not enough. I think you really need to make an effort to look at the same thing together, and even better, to draw the same thing together. I'm not saying that your client should be next to you all the time during the whole design process, but periodically you should actively involve them into drawing together so they can see the design come to life. And you can kind of look at the same thing and figure out the design together, because that's a way to really get on the same page and to avoid a nasty feedback loop that you don't want. Of course, you're going to refine the designs by yourself or with your team, and design is an iterative process. So this process of getting on the same page will repeat itself a few times during a project. But the right way, like involving the client often and early, leads to a different feedback cycle. If you just send over the designs, you maybe, depending on the person, get back a sort of like large document with bullet point feedback. And I think bullet point feedback is the worst. But it's actually your own fault if you receive bullet point feedback, or at least the fault of the person who is communicating the designs for you. Because if the client was educated on the feedback process, if you were clear when you expect feedback and in which format, you would not get bullet point feedback. Although I have to say that different clients have different communication styles, so you kind of have to adapt to how someone works. I think there's two main types of persons. The first type is the one who wants to comment live in the meeting and who's maybe a bit chaotic and just wants to say what's on her mind or his mind. And then the other person is more like a structured person who maybe you want to send the design ahead of the meeting so they can prepare their thoughts and have a bit more structure to the meeting. So let's move on to the next section, which is about design and prototyping work. A while ago, I was interviewing someone and they asked me, what is your design process? And I didn't really have a clear answer for the person I was interviewing. What's your design process? I shared this slide in the previous version of the talk, so the 2015 version of this talk that shows the design fidelity over time. And most of the time it goes like this, like there's a sketch, there's a wireframe, then there's a visual design, and maybe we validate it with a prototype. But the reality of design is often a lot messier. People try to graph design with the double diamond process, like in this slide. And there is some truth to what is on this slide. Discover, define, develop, deliver. I mean, yes, that's kind of the process. But the reality of a design process is more like this. First, there's an uncertain period where you don't really know what you're doing, but you're going in all kinds of directions. You do research, you uncover patterns, you get to insights, and then you get into like an execution zone where you have clarity, focus, and where the design lands. So you have a phase of convergence and divergence. I would say there's just many different ingredients of the design process. And if you have more ingredients, more interesting ingredients, you can maybe cook a better dish. So I think some aspects of the design process that I want to highlight here are doing user research, doing usability testing. And I know I don't do it often enough. So that's why I just want to stress it. I have to do this more, user research as a team. We have to do it more, usability testing, because that's when you really validate your design. You can sketch all you want, and I love to sketch. Maybe I used to love sketching on a big piece of paper, like in the photo on the left. Now I prefer the whiteboard, use different colors, take a photo. And there's so many things you can do in a design process. You can try to make detailed wireframes. You can think about content order, so that's more for like websites. You can use breadboards, which is an interesting technique. I will put all the links, so there's a link on the slide, so I will put all the links also at the end of my slides when I share the slide, so you don't need to worry about like taking a screenshot or capturing this. The slides will be shared. Then in relationship to development, there's product specifications, there's development tickets, there is feature stories. There's so much that is not visual design and prototypes. So of course, visual design and prototypes are a big part of the process, but yeah, you're going to spend a lot of time designing. Of course, you're going to spend a lot of time in Sketch or Figma or Framer or whatever you use to design. You're also going to spend a lot of time making prototypes. But the thing is that I'm kind of highlighting in front of the design work, the research work, because that is often neglected. That theory of the order to design, it doesn't really make that much sense to me anymore. I don't really know how to describe the design process other than there are a lot of different ingredients you could use at any point in time, and depending on existing design processes and depending on what you're doing and what you have in front of you, you're going to make a choice on a strategy, and then you typically might even change strategy every day or every week, depending on the phase of your design work and what is asked of you. Now about the tools. I know you had a big session about tools, so let me just talk about the tools that we use at Mono to get things done. I think a good UI designer is great at using his or her tools and just at using a computer in general. And for the design work at Mono, we mostly use Figma these days. There is the odd sketch file, but almost everything is done in Figma. And I like Figma so much that I even give workshops about it. So I give a Figma workshop where I teach people about how to use Figma. And I think the reason I like it so much is the collaboration aspect. Of course, it's a nice tool, but really it's the collaboration aspect that sets it apart from other tools. So Adobe, we still have a few licenses for Adobe, mostly for Illustrator and Photoshop. Even though Figma is really good, it's still lacking in certain areas. The vector tools are not as great as Illustrator. The photo editing capabilities are practically non-existent. So for some of my design work, I still go back to Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop. So maybe a bit of a topic change, not about tools, but about the design work itself. What I want to say in this section is that as a UI designer, it is super, super, super important to not try and reinvent the wheel. For example, and I see this all the time, think about the dropdown. And people always want to customize their dropdowns. But yeah, there might be a good reason to customize your dropdown. Maybe you want colors in your dropdown. Maybe the dropdown is actually a tree list, and there's maybe project-specific needs why you want to customize your dropdown. But I would be super careful to go down the route of making a custom control. If you look at the requirements, like objective requirements of a custom dropdown box, and I say objective, by this, I mean requirements in relationship to like the standard dropdown of the operating system and what it supports. Just to match the dropdown of the operating system, you kind of have to have built-in support for all of these things. And I see it all the time that projects have like broken dropdowns. There's accessibility problems. There's performance problems. It just doesn't work the right way. So I would be super careful in general to customize user interfaces. There's groups at Apple, groups at Microsoft that have worked for years to get to a good UI control. You cannot fix it in your local project. It's a problem, even if there are problems with custom dropdowns, it's a problem that has to be solved as a whole in the industry on the operating system level. You can't fix it in your own project. So let me move to the next slide, which is related. User interface work is actually quite specific. 90% of times your UI lives on top of someone else's UI. So your web application UI, it lives on top of it lives in a browser, and then the browser lives in the operating system. So it's not like you have full control over everything. You need to respect and understand the platform that you're working in. And you need to understand the conventions, and you kind of need to understand where you can customize and where you should maybe stay away from customizing. So let's take Apple as an example, but you can also apply this to Microsoft and Google. Apple changes their platforms every year. They have a developer conference, and every few years there's like a big update to the operating system. During those developer conferences, they talk about the changes they make, or the changes they made, and they put those changes back into platform guidelines. Apple has their guidelines, Microsoft has their guidelines, Google has guidelines, which I don't particularly like. But Apple's guidelines, I want to zoom in a little bit on that because there is quite some gold in there. I think if you're doing UI design, you should really have read the human interface guidelines by Apple. And what you have to realize is that you're really standing on the shoulders of giants when you're designing within, let's say, an operating system like iOS. If you follow Apple's guidelines, you will get a usable app. Apple's guidelines are so deep and they have such a long history. Did you know that these guidelines have been around for like over 30 years? Like people were talking about the same kind of things that we are talking about today. Like where is the don't save button? Like what is the button order in a modal? I still see Medium articles about this, and this has been well thought out a long time ago. So if I see some bad advice on Medium and this 1992 advice is much better than whatever the person wrote, then I think maybe you should take a look at this human interface guide. It's actually quite good. So lately there's been a bit of a resurgence in UI kits, especially because of Figma's community feature. So you can use Figma's community feature to find open source design files. You can duplicate them to your own Figma environment. For example, this macOS Big Sur UI kit. And I think it's interesting to have a kit, but don't kid yourself. It's not because you have the kit that you can design. I really believe that you have to know how to draw the pixels yourself. The kit is there to help, but the real way to master things is to construct your own UI design kit. There was WWDC, Apple's conference, and I kind of played around with a screenshot and tried to recreate it in Figma. So this is kind of like my recreation of Apple's interface. It's not pixel perfect, but I was trying to figure out, like, okay, so what kind of design decisions did they make in the latest version of macOS? All right, enough about the design work. Let's move on to prototypes. I think there are different kinds of prototypes, different types of prototypes. Paper prototypes, I don't particularly like them, but okay, it's a type of prototype. There's the clickable prototype, which you might make in Sketch or Figma, or you might make in InVision app, but that's a bit old school. Maybe you make them in Keynote, but then it's not really clickable. There's also a code prototype, which you could make like with a full-blown HTML, CSS prototype, or maybe it's just an interaction and you have this kind of like small UI demo. And I think there's a bit of a balance between a slick design presentation and a working demo. Like, for example, just like being able to check out the interactions kind of always wins versus like a super slick presentation that has a static design. Let the user interact with your design, with what you're making, and then it will lead to a better understanding of how they are using it, which in turn can lead to nice feedback, which you can use to improve your design. I want to, again, put the focus on usability testing. I think there's nothing that will let you question your design more than a usability test. And I've actually never regretted doing a usability test. I sometimes think it's a lot of preparation and I'm not sure if it will have any value, but then I do the test and immediately after the test, I know how to fix my design. So enough about that. Next section is building our own tooling. So you have the tools that are out there, but we found that it's not always enough to only have the tool that is out there. We don't only deliver static designs with Mono. We also do a little bit of front-end development. So we code prototypes in HTML and CSS. And we have our own prototyping tool that's called Bedrock that we like to use to create big prototypes, mostly for web applications. And the reason we created our own tool is because it allows us to work at scale. So, for example, in this demo that we show clients about the kind of web applications that we make, we have 41 different pages with different states. So it just doesn't scale. If you try to update it into a design file, at some point, it just becomes too much. And to really scale design, but also to make sure you have a better deliverable that has like less risk of getting worse in the actual development, we really love HTML prototypes, and they have been really good for us the past 5 years. So we use a tool called Bedrock. It's a tool that we developed, a tool to help designers prototype using code. It's free and open source, and it can be used by anyone. It's available at bedrockapp.org, and it's also open source, so anybody can like fork it or make their own version of it or try to contribute to the main project. Currently, Bedrock 2 is in development. This is like a whole separate talk if I want to, so I'm just gonna skip this slide in the interest of time. And I wanna finalize this presentation with a section on getting better at your craft. I think new designers, they talk about like, should I design, should I develop? should I maybe spend time doing UX research? And I think a message I have for new designers, for people just starting out, is that you have time. A career is 45 years, so you have plenty of time to learn all kinds of things. And every year, me and Xavier, so Xavier is my business partner, we ask ourselves the question, like, am I growing? Like, on a personal level, did I learn something? Am I growing as a designer, or maybe as a manager, or maybe as a UX researcher? Like, whatever direction you want to grow in, are you growing? I think it's hugely important to ask yourself this question. And I want to point out 6 strategies that you can use to grow. So make learning a constant, improve your platform knowledge, try out every UI, so everything you encounter, even if it's just a bank UI, save everything, so build your own archive, learn something else that is creative, so try and invest in some other field, and do experiments and dream. I'm just going to speed up a little bit because I see that I don't have a lot of time left. So make learning a constant. You can learn through conference talks, books, and blog posts. And I find that the top-level conference talks, I think that's the most important one to learn from, because a conference talk is typically a lot of knowledge from those books compiled into a compelling talk. And my favorite talk is called Inventing on Principle. It's a talk by Brett Victor. And the main point of this talk is that creators need an immediate connection to what they create. And he talks about building tools, and those tools can lead to better creations. And in the case of this slide, he's like building an iPad tool to animate the leaf, so he can animate it with his finger. I think books are great, but one of the problems with books is that sometimes they contain dated information. First point on this slide is that you don't have to read the whole book. It's not a novel, so you can maybe skip ahead to the relevant parts of the book. But what I was talking about is, are they relevant anymore? Because most of these books are a few years old, especially like the Green Book, that's more like 20 years old, or the Tufte book about visual display of quantitative information. There's another Tufte book on the stack, I think, Envisioning Information. So those books are, I mean, they contain some good information, but they are quite dated. So you really have to know what you're looking for and what you have to, you can get out of a book. And it then helps to have maybe some mentor figure who can tell you, like, this part of the book is interesting, this part of the book is interesting, but please skip this part because it's entirely dated. Improving the platform knowledge. My tip there would be to keep an eye on the operating system you are not using. So I use a Mac, I use an iPhone, and that's iOS. So sometimes I really study material design, or I use Windows just to get a feel of how it works again. Maybe there's an update to those platforms, and I check it out, because the majority of the world uses Android, the majority of the world uses Windows, so they are your users, so you kind of need to understand how they use their computer. So all of those vendors have their own conference. And I'm going to zoom in on Apple's conference again, where last year, Tom Adriaanse, this is an iOS developer from Belgium, gave a talk about SF symbols. And that's just one talk that I wanted to highlight that is really something you should see, especially if you're into icon design. Try out every UI, be curious, test new software. Xavier, my colleague, he likes Rome Research. I'm particularly fond of this new app called app. It's a funny name, but it's used to make presentations a bit more lively. And I can get inspiration from all sorts of sources, like PlayStation games, or Formula One, or movies, and even from things like ticket vending machines on the street, or synthesizer. But then if you found all that cool stuff, you have to save it. You have to build a personal archive full of folders and notes, and have some kind of knowledge base like Notion, which is awesome, to kind of keep track of all your knowledge. And sort your files every once in a while. have like a software like Pinboard or Instapaper to save those links and to make sure that whenever you need a piece of information that you can find it back. So we're almost at the end of the slide deck, and got 2 more points to make, or 3 more points, I'm not sure. One of those points is this one: learn something else that is creative. So I think everything is a remix, and it helps if you can look through the lens of another field. So in this video series, the creator of the video series explains how creation requires an influence, and how most things that we perceive as original work are actually a remix adaptation of someone else's work. And I think it is interesting if you can cross-reference 2 fields, because that's how you can create unique things. So as for myself, I spent some time doing photography for a while, so maybe I can reference the field of photography and the field of design and combine something that is more interesting and that has not existed before. Do experiments, have side projects. So I think experiments are great to learn. And in most work projects, you won't have the time to work on the details, on the like little user interface details, but you can do a side project. In the side project, spend the time on it. And then when you get to the real project, you can apply it. Not sure what's going on. There's double slides in here. To house our experiments, we made a new section on our website called Mono Labs, and that's where we will put all sorts of experiments. And I think I made a bit of a mistake here with double slides, this is actually the next slide, which is about Skilliverse. So Skilliverse is a project where I kind of made an experiment on how to deal with reactive data. So in Skilliverse, you have different data points, and you can change the data points, and the whole interface will react. So you change the data point on the top left here, and the other data points are going to react. Next project I want to feature here is more like a personal project. So I do this every year. It's called Best of, so Best of 2019 or Best of 2018. And in this project, I experimented with doing like page transitions. So making sure that if you change the page, that it's smooth, and that maybe there's some like interesting animations going on. And I find that doing these side projects really helps, because it often leads to insights which I can use in my work. So to finalize this talk, the final point about learning is having a wish list. The work that is in your portfolio is the work that you will get hired for. So I think every designer should have a design wish list. And this is kind of like my design wish list. On the left side are the projects I have started, and on the right side are the projects that, if I ever find the time, I would love to work on. So these are kind of like side projects. I haven't really done a full design for, like, let's say IFE or point of sale, but this is what I'm aiming for. I hope to land a job one day that allows me to work on this topic, because it's a dream of mine to work on that kind of interface. And we founded Mono with a quote from Dieter Rams, less but better. And that's kind of my aim as a designer, to create things, not too much things, not too many things, but things that are just simply better, and to always look at things through a lens of improvement. I'm done. Oof. I'm sorry if I went on too long. And I think that's the end of the talk. I hope that Annie has collected questions in the chat, and then I'm just gonna exit the presentation and be ready for some questions.
Yes, but stay here. Thank you so much, Johan. Wow, that really covered a lot. And there was a lot of chatting going on. And I also know that I made a lot of notes about some several tools and apps that I'm going to look into later. So thank you. That was very thorough a very interesting talk. Agreed. We've got time for just maybe one or two quick questions. And I'm kind of combining a few thoughts that I saw in the chat to kind of cover as much as possible. But of course, people can join you in your own session right after your talk. So if you want to talk directly to Johan and ask him your question, if I couldn't cover it, then go to his session after this. But the first question that I want to ask is, personally, when I talk to UX designers, I usually try to ask them, what's the hardest part of your job? What's the biggest pain points? And by far the most common answer is dealing with client presentations and getting good feedback and that whole dynamic. So I appreciate that you included a slide about that. I was kind of intrigued by the no bullet points list thing that you said. And I was wondering if you just wanted to briefly elaborate on that. Specifically because you're already used to being a quite remote company, what's your ideal scenario in collaborating on both presenting a design and getting good feedback from your clients? And then a second part of that question is like, how does this translate to a remote working scenario, which a lot of us are in right now? So do you have any more advice on that?
Yeah, so the bullet point feedback, that would be like a traditional email with a lot of bullet points, like change this there. And typically today it's better because maybe the bullet points are in context. So in Figma, you would have like on your artboard, if you allow the client to do that, you would at least have the feedback in context. But I think that's great for like a spelling error or for like a small mistake, but you shouldn't hold the design discussion using this like bullet point feedback, because the main problem with it is that typically if the feedback is complex, it goes on like a thought train, and it kind of like starts to put like clauses in there, like if this, if that, maybe like there's some thoughts, but there's no way to answer those thoughts. So I think design feedback should be a conversation, because then you can recap what the other person is trying to say. Do it in a meeting. Really, don't try like, I love asynchronicity for like reporting or like status things, and just like making sure that like the client knows that you're actively working on the project. But for like discussing the actual design, I think that's a synchronous thing. You should do it like direct in a call, or even if possible, just like in front of a whiteboard, in a meeting room where you are together.
So with dialogue, for sure, I agree. Yeah, it's a challenge. So I'm wondering if that can be a good topic for the session afterwards, if people have specific questions about that, because again, especially since your company's already been working remotely for so long, I'm sure people will have questions about how you handle that with clients as well. And then the second thing I wanted to bring up that let's touch on it briefly, but then also have it again be a topic for the session is respecting the focus work time. There are a lot of people chatting about that, and I think that's it's this awkward situation. Like, how do you ask for that? Has it changed more since switching to COVID-19, the work from home situation? Is it easier for people to is it easier for you to kind of be able to turn off, or is it harder? I think it's actually, I would like to hear a lot of people's opinions on this. Maybe in one hand, you're not getting interruptions by people walking up to your desk all day, but maybe you're getting a lot more notifications or messages than usual. And how do you manage that? Just interpersonal issue of being like, give me my space.
I think it's maker versus manager. So I think a manager should be like a shit umbrella. So the shit comes down and the manager has to be the umbrella, because then the designers can work on their design. And in order to create a focus zone, you kind of need less meetings. I was kind of triggered by some designs, some tweets from the Figma design team and some American designers, and they kind of shared like screenshots of their calendar, and it looked like my calendar. But for me, it's fine if I have like 15 minutes there and half an hour there, because I'm mostly managing, not designing. But then for the IC, for the person who has to design, they really need that at least half day blocks without meetings. So at Mono, we make a conscious effort to have less meetings and also to talk about as a group, like, do you think we have too many meetings or too few? Like, we kind of like try to feel it out. But since we've been working remote for a while, yeah, things obviously changed because we were semi-remote. So we had like a team day in the middle of the week before COVID. So the meeting structure changes, but I think you just have to like talk about it as a group. Like if you find that your manager doesn't give you enough space, like tell them and try to maybe influence the meeting structure of your team.
Yeah, amen. It's just like setting relationship boundaries, you know? You're like, I need 4 hours a day of uninterrupted.
Yeah, and also just want to say that designers do not belong in a dev stand-up. So if you are forced to join a dev stand-up for 5 minutes every day, then yeah, you're wasting your time.
All right. Bold words.
All right.
Okay. Well, let's take a break. We'll come back at 8 o'clock. So that leaves us a few minutes to join you in the sessions if you have questions or do some quick networking. But we'll come back on the main stage at 8 for Philippe's talk. Thanks again, Johan.
Thank you.
All right.